You thought you knew those quiet towns, the porches with wind chimes, the bakery windows fogged at dawn, the old men sweeping sidewalks in the early light. But beneath the neat lawns and postcard façades, some of the stories people call local lore are not harmless myths. They are the memory of real crimes, of disappearances that never stopped, of rooms that were locked and never opened. Tonight, we begin to pull those threads apart. 10 small-town legends in Pennsylvania that turn out to be far darker than anyone expected. These are not sensational ghost tales told to frighten teenagers. These are accounts tied to police reports, search warrants, ground-penetrating radar scans, and the work of family members who would not, could not, let a story die. They show how ordinary gestures can hide danger, how community silence can protect what should not be protected, and how the patience of investigators and new forensic tools sometimes force the past to speak. Caption: Unraveling Disturbing Small-Town Legends in Pennsylvania. 10 True Stories Spanning Decades. Minersville. The town looked like any other on a late summer afternoon. Narrow Main Street, a diner that smelled of coffee and fried dough, a church bell that rang at noon. James arrived in that town believing in a simple kindness. People said hello, took in newcomers. He found exactly that in the woman next door, a grandmotherly figure who left an apple pie on his stoop the first week he moved in. It was a small-town gesture that should have been comforting. Except the gestures kept coming, and so did other things. At night, James began to notice low-watt headlights pulling up in front of Mrs. Kowalski's house. Men and women stepped from cars, took what looked to James like delivery bags, and left within minutes. The visits were regular enough that he could mark them in his mind by the way the porch light flicked. A slow click, 2 slow clicks, then a door opening. One evening, he saw a handful of canvas sacks carried out under the cover of dusk. When he later peered from behind a sagging fence, he saw a pallet of tightly wrapped packages stacked in the garage. He told himself small-town explanations at first. Maybe she was dropping off supplies for a church drive. Maybe those were grocery bags. Neighbors covered for neighbors, and townspeople do strange things for each other all the time. But the frequency made James uneasy. When he learned that someone in town had overdosed and that other residents whispered about supply runs, the small gestures no longer fit the pattern of ordinary kindness. Fractured by doubt, James did something not every newcomer would do. He called the state police. He gave them dates, times, descriptions of vehicles. The record shows what followed. State police executed a raid weeks later. Search warrants listed bags of suspected narcotics, packaging materials, scales, evidence cataloged and sealed. Official reports note quantities that moved an investigation from social suspicion to criminal inquiry. Arrests were made, and in the town's front pages, the story was reduced to a headline: Minersville Neighbor Arrested in Drug Ring. Caption: Minersville, 2023, Raid and Arrests. But headlines cover more than names. For James, who had knocked on a neighbor's goodwill and found a darker truth, the costs were immediate and unexpected. He had imagined his apple pie neighbor sitting on a screened porch, not appearing in a mugshot. Long after the press moved on, James kept replaying the small details. The sound of the porch light, the chalk mark someone had made on the back fence, the way a conversation with Mrs. Kowalski had ended with a quiet offer, an offer he perceived as a test more than an invitation. He left town, not for safety alone, but because the easiest way to live with the betrayal was to remove himself from its geography. There are practical consequences too. The raid produced evidence that entered the criminal justice system. Arrests led to pending court records. But there's another record that is harder to quantify: the erosion of trust. For a place built on neighborliness, that betrayal becomes a cautionary tale. An apple pie left at the door might be a sign of welcome, or it might be the first gesture in a lineage of concealment.
If this story is unsettling, it should be, because Minersville is not an outlier. It is a pattern, small domestic scenes that, when looked at closely, begin to form a map of something deeper and more harmful. If this investigation feels vital to you and you want more careful examinations like this, subscribe now and ring the bell. We'll continue with the next stories in this series. The next town sits among the endless rows of corn that characterize parts of Lancaster County. In the late summer of 1987, 17-year-old Ella Whitmore walked away from a farmhouse everyone believed was safe. She was responsible, the sort of kid who checked in, who paid attention to chores, who knew how to navigate a life that depended on seasons and schedules. On the day she vanished, Ella had walked toward the cornfield at dusk. When she failed to return, her mother and father assumed she had found a neighbor or a friend. When they realized she had not come back, the family's routine cracked. Search parties fanned out that night and the next. Neighbors joined the effort, flashlights bobbing like slow, anxious fireflies. The first odd detail the searchers found was a pair of shoes, placed neatly beside the farmhouse door. Not discarded as you might expect, but set with an orderliness that suggested someone had removed them for a purpose. Track dogs were brought in. The dogs followed a faint scent that petered out at the edge of the corn line, where the stalks grew thick and the ground was loose. Weeks turned to months. Tips poured in and led nowhere. Police reports cataloged interviews, alibis, and the type of human detail that only makes absence feel more present. The sweater she loved, the bench on which she waited for a bus that no longer came. Over time, as happens in rural communities, explanations multiplied. Some said she had left of her own accord. Others feared a stranger's hand. The family fought to keep the search alive. The town's attention fractured into competing loyalties. Years later, a separate discovery, remains recovered from another county, prompted investigators to run comparisons. The remains in that unrelated case were not Ella's. Skeletal analysis and dental records excluded her. Under current case files, Ella Whitmore remains listed as missing, unsolved. There are anniversaries marked by candles and fences where friends have affixed small tokens, ribbons tied and left to fray in the wind. In 2012, on the 25th anniversary of her disappearance, the family held a small vigil. They told reporters no new leads had emerged, but they would not stop looking. Caption: Lancaster County, 1987, case open. Long after the searches ended, the cornfield acquires a different kind of weight. Locals cross the road rather than walk the boundary at dusk. When strangers drive through, someone always catches their license plate numbers. The thing about these landscapes is how ordinary they can remain outwardly, while, inside a family, time freezes and the absence becomes a permanent feature of daily life. We move now from fields to a house at the edge of the Pocono Woods. Cheap, remote, purchased by a man named Ryan Chen, who wanted distance, who wanted to outrun the burnout that had crept into his life. To him, the house promised solitude, a small property with weathered siding and a fireplace that hinted at winter evenings he could spend in the gentle company of silence. What Ryan found instead were sounds that insisted on being acknowledged. The reports he later filed and the notes he shared with a friend described strange late-night noises, footsteps in rooms no one occupied, items he had set down in the kitchen rearranged in ways that made no sense. Once, while recording a late-night audio loop on an old handheld device, Ryan captured a brief clip, a whisper that, when played back, yielded what some listeners would describe as a name. He taped a small symbol above his door in pen, a curving sigil he said he hoped would be a protective mark, an attempt to convert a neighbor's superstition into an anchor. The house had more history than a sale deed could show. A previous owner had a documented episode of erratic behavior in local clinic files. He had sold the home suddenly and left town, his collapse a whisper in the town's gossip. Locals told Ryan stories. The house had been painted a dozen colors. The fireplace had never drawn properly. The basement had once been used to store a trunk that made a neighbor uneasy.
Such details are the kind that make a place ripe for folklore. A collapsed previous occupant, an odd feature that refuses function, a symbol found by a new tenant. Ryan's experience resisted neat categorization. He reported seeing a shadow that did not align with any light source. He experienced cold spots in hallways even in summer. He felt a presence while he slept, followed by vivid nightmares that left him trembling. He sought out a counselor, then a friend who recorded interviews with him. He sold the house a year later, convinced that something about the place, or perhaps the exhaustion that made him susceptible to misperception, could not be disentangled from the architecture. Caption: Toby Hanna, Pocono, 2018-2020, Unresolved, Local Lore. Where the line gets hazy is in the way local lore and private distress can feed one another. Some neighbors described late-night rituals. Others said Ryan had been alone too long, chasing a narrative that made sense of his anxiety. For investigators and for mental health professionals, the case raises questions about how to treat reports that cross the boundary between the plausible and the psychological. Ryan's account sits, explicitly, between those poles. A story that is part haunting, part human breakdown. He left town, and for months after his departure, neighbors claimed in small, wry ways that the house still listened. A couple who bought it after him reported minimal issues. A different family, years later, told a different story. The house keeps no consistent testimony, but holds a consistent effect. It becomes a place people mention when they talk about the things our town would rather not name. From haunted house anecdotes, we move to a case that begins in a genealogy archive, a quiet place for other people's pasts to gather, and ends in a backyard excavation. Haley Whitmore did family research as a hobby: wills, old boarding house ledgers, a stack of yellow newspapers. She expected to find names and dates. What she did not expect to find was a missing person notice from 1972 about a man named Walter Kensington. The article described him simply: a boarder who vanished from the Whitmore family boarding house after complaining about strange noises below the floorboards. Haley's curiosity deepened when she noticed a name repeated in the ledger, her grandparents' names adjacent to a notation about basement work in the months after Walter's disappearance. Old Town Directory showed that the boarding house took a building permit for a basement renovation shortly after the man vanished. That seemed like a coincidence until Haley began to interview neighbors and found former tenants reluctant to talk, evasive when pressed. One woman finally mentioned that the grandparents had taken in odd jobs and had repaired the cellar to keep out drafts. The woman's tone shifted when she said the repair happened quickly, as if it had been an afterthought converted into necessity. Haley hired a private investigator to locate police records. The investigator discovered a paper trail, a short, terse missing person report filed in the 1970s, and a brief inquiry that had not progressed. There were mentions of threats from an unnamed source to anyone willing to testify, scribbled in a detective's margin. The PI also located photographs taken at the time: the boarding house with fresh mortar on the foundation and a shadowed diffraction in the cellar doorway that, in print, looked indistinct and bleak. Years later, with permissions in hand from living relatives, modern investigators brought a ground-penetrating radar team onto the Whitmore property. The GPR showed an anomaly beneath the cellar floor. Excavation revealed what the team had feared: human remains within a shallow area that had been disturbed and hastily covered decades before. Forensic analysis later linked the remains to Walter Kensington based on dental records and a comparison of old medical records the family provided. Caption: McKissport, 1972-2019, excavation and identification, case reopened as homicide. The discovery reopened a wound. Detectives classified the case as a homicide. The file was no longer a missing person file and entered the purview of modern homicide investigators. But the living who might have known were mostly gone.
Haley's grandparents had died years earlier. Witnesses' memories had frayed. Documents were incomplete. No living suspects stood in the dock. The town, which had taken decades to speak in any unified voice, had to confront its past all at once. For Haley, the excavation was vindication and tragedy. She had begun as someone curious about her lineage and ended up unearthed in the middle of a family's buried secret. Her struggle was not merely legal but moral. How to reconcile the fact that her own family home may have harbored evidence of a violent act. She arranged a small ceremony for Walter, and local newspapers called the reopening a rare instance when amateur genealogical work had led to a tangible resolution. Yet, the justice it demanded, an accountable living person, remained elusive. There is a pattern here that recurs in these towns. A small household action, a basement renovation, a repaired hearth, a sealed door that later reads differently under the light of investigation. Domestic labor in such contexts can be reframed as concealment. The story arc we follow now turns to a landscape dominated not by porches or fields, but by rock and water, a quarry outside the town of Wooing in Bradford County. Sheriff Adam Torres arrived in town with the kind of quiet skepticism that often marks rural law enforcement professionals. He had served in counties where bad things hide as well as good things do. Quarries, he knew, could be places where accidents happen and where bodies are sometimes returned to the earth and never recovered.
The locals had memories of the quarry that were ritualistic. Small wooden crosses nailed into trees on the perimeter. The names of those who had died there posted on a faded board near the entrance. Candles left on rain-slicked platforms. But the more Adam lingered, the more those rituals seemed to be wearing knives beneath their ribbons. Older residents murmured about a string of incidents that, if taken together, suggested something other than misadventure. They told Adam about nights when trucks came through with their headlights off, when men met at the waterline and left with cargo hidden beneath tarpaulins, when a drowned man's body had been found too high on the bank for the claim of fell from the cliff. One elderly witness, whose name appears in the sheriff's file, spoke of threats made to anyone who asked questions about what happened near the quarry. She recounted seeing small groups meet late at night and the way some men avoided eye contact in grocery aisles thereafter. Her testimony, given reluctantly to the sheriff on record, mentioned names that would be sensitive to repeat here. In the case files, those names are marked and cross-checked with business licenses and the limited surveillance records that existed. Adam pursued GPR sweeps along the quarry's perimeter after receiving an anonymous tip. The scans registered anomalies consistent with disturbed earth in multiple locations. Excavations began, and the sample cores turned up bone fragments and materials that suggested an interment not tied to official records. But power runs both ways. As the sheriff pushed, he reported being met with subtle acts of intimidation. Vehicles idled outside his home at odd hours. Anonymous letters arrived that suggested he should stop asking about old things. Faced with that pressure, Adam made choices that would cost him his place in that community. He refused, according to his own statements, to accept cash offered by a local intermediary meant to keep things quiet. And when he informed his superiors that the threat had escalated, the political calculus in county offices became complicated. There is a record of an internal conversation about the limits of local authority when confronted with powerful economic interests, tied, it was alleged, to smuggling and other hidden trades. On a humid July night, Adam packed his patrol-issued bag and left town, citing personal safety. He took with him the quarry files and the knowledge that some parts of his county had been arranged to look like commonplace tragedy while concealing coordinated wrongdoing. These are the kinds of choices that silence communities, not always overt threats, but the steady chipping away of trust and the knowledge that asking too many questions can cost you more than your reputation.
We stop here for a moment, at a place where the ground shows what it has hidden. And the men and women who seek to reveal the truth must choose whether to stay and pay the price or leave and survive. The pattern repeats across Pennsylvania. Normal gestures, unremarkable landscapes, sudden absences, and the people who refuse to let those absences settle into silence. Ahead lie more stories. A roommate's disappearance in a college town, a pattern of missing people in a remote borough, an inherited house with a sealed room that contained terrible proof. Each one will help us see the same motif in a new light. How legends grow around facts, and how facts sometimes masquerade as legend to protect the living. Ahead lie more stories. A roommate's disappearance in a college town, a pattern of missing people in a remote borough, an inherited house with a sealed room that contained terrible proof. Each one will help us see the same motif in a new light. How legends grow around facts, and how facts sometimes masquerade as legend to protect the living. Ahead lie more stories. A roommate's disappearance in a college town, a pattern of missing people in a remote borough, an inherited house with a sealed room that contained terrible proof. Each one will help us see the same motif in a new light. How legends grow around facts, and how facts sometimes masquerade as legend to protect the living. Caption: Next up, State College, Nora Blackwell and Stephanie Chen, 2009, unresolved/voluntary disappearance alleged. But before we continue, take a breath with us. These narratives are difficult to sit with. They are about loss and about the stubborn, small-scale courage of those who keep asking questions. When we return, we will enter a college apartment where a purse and a phone were left behind, and where a single photograph taken months later reframed a disappearance in a way that left families and investigators split between hope and suspicion. The photograph that changed everything arrived months after the initial search ended. It was anonymous, a grainy shot emailed to an address set up for tips, time-stamped and unremarked. It showed a woman standing in a familiar mall corridor, head turned just enough to be identified by someone who knew her hair and a mole near the jawline. For the Whitmore family, it read like a promise. For Nora Blackwell, it became a crack that widened into a chasm. Caption: State College, 2009, unresolved, reclassified as voluntary disappearance by investigators. Nora and Stephanie had been roommates at a small off-campus apartment near the university. Neighbors remembered the late-night laughter, the stack of dishes neither seemed to mind, the way the apartment's one window glowed into the street on winter evenings. On the morning Stephanie vanished, her purse remained on the couch, her phone was in the kitchen, and a coffee mug sat cooling on the table. Her car was found a few blocks away, doors unlocked, the passenger seat folded forward as if someone had stepped out in a hurry. Initial police files show the case opening as a missing person report. It moved through the usual local steps: witness interviews, security camera requests, door-to-door canvassing. Detectives logged calls with friends and family. They noted a small cash deposit found in Stephanie's account the week before she disappeared, and a pattern of coded messages on her phone that, when decrypted by investigators, suggested she had been communicating with someone outside the immediate friend group. Suspicion, as it often does in small towns, settled unevenly. Some officers briefly considered the possibility of foul play.
Others weighed the personal histories in play. Stephanie had been seen arguing with a man in a nearby bar weeks earlier, but that lead was soft. The strongest lines in the case file were the unforced ones: a series of ATM withdrawals at odd times, and an encrypted contact list that did not resolve neatly to relatives or coworkers. Nora found herself under intense scrutiny. She told reporters later that detectives visited the apartment repeatedly and questioned her about every detail of her life. Police logs confirm many such interviews. Friends described her as cooperative but exhausted, a woman whose life had been picked through by investigators and neighbors in the weeks after the disappearance. Rumors multiplied in the absence of answers. Stories about secret relationships, whispers about life choices. The strain cracked friendships and left both women's families splintered by conjecture. Then the photograph surfaced. It was small, nondescript, and not, on its face, proof of anything beyond somebody's sighting. For the Whitmore family, it offered hope. For investigators, it complicated an already thin case. The state police added the image to case files and conducted enhanced image analysis. But the shot contained no license plate numbers, no clear timestamp beyond the sender's metadata. Without corroborating footage, the image could not, alone, reconstruct a timeline. The authorities' public statement months later explained the effect. Investigators considered the possibility that Stephanie had chosen to leave voluntarily, prompting a reclassification of the file from endangered missing to voluntary disappearance. That decision, officials said, reflected an evidentiary standard rather than moral judgment. Lacking proof of abduction, and with financial records indicating recent withdrawals, investigators could no longer sustain a predication of criminal interference. The family disagreed publicly and privately. Those who knew Stephanie insisted she would have told someone before she left. Others felt that adults had the right to opt out of their lives. Caption: Status note: investigators reclassified. Case unresolved. Authorities request tips. For Nora, the costs were profound. The implication, even when carefully worded in police reports, is tangible. Public suspicion is a corrosive thing. She lost work opportunities, faced whispered accusations, and carried the weight of a town speculation that had nothing to do with evidence. Friends who once visited stopped calling. In small towns, the rumor mill oils itself with grief, and grief often needs a target. The most enduring harm in the State College case was not the lack of physical evidence, but the social consequences of being caught in its orbit. Yet the photograph also changed the conversation. Private investigators and citizen sleuth communities debated its authenticity, combed public transit footage, and spent long nights mapping Stephanie's known contacts. He was, by all accounts, exhausted and increasingly isolated. Despite this, Tyler unearthed what seemed to be a concrete lead: an old, partially collapsed structure on the outskirts of town where a wallet and identification had once been photographed. A historical society member later brought to light a ledger from the 1980s that referenced repairs to that property after structural failure and noted a parcel cleared by contractor. The ledger's shorthand often meant little until paired with Tyler's other threads: an unusual spike in transient workers listed on payroll records, and state permit filings that showed short, sudden bursts of demolition work. Caption: Emporium Research. Archive gaps, intimidation incidents, physical lead removed. Tyler planned to present his research at a town hall meeting. He intended to lay out names and dates, to push officials to reopen files with state assistance. The night before the meeting, his phone received an anonymous message, a brief warning to stop digging. He went to the meeting anyway. The attendance was small, the responses measured, and the mayor offered a bland promise to look into Tyler's claims. Minutes later, the meeting room's thermostat, whose records later proved malfunctioning frequently, caught fire, an event that by footage and maintenance logs appeared accidental but watched in sequence felt like pressure. Under mounting stress and after repeated acts that would have wearied most people, Tyler left Emporium. He took his notes, printed copies of the microfilm he had rescued, and a few photographs whose provenance he had verified. He continued to share information with journalists and a regional cold case unit, but in the town itself, the silence settled like dust. Files that might have been reopened sat on shelves. Tyburn County's clerks, when later asked about missing documents, told reporters they had no record of removal. The Emporium story is less about a single solved case than about a pattern of community behavior that can obscure patterns. The gradual closing of doors, the erosion of records, and the social price paid by the person who insists on looking. Tyler's research remains a thread, one that other investigators may pull on in years to come.
The town keeps its own version of the legend, a quiet place where those who ask too much are quietly encouraged to leave. From suppression and erasure, we return to a house where evidence could not be kept quiet forever. In a Victorian row house in New Hope, an inherited key opened a door that had been sealed for decades. And what lay behind that door forced a community to reconcile a private obsession with public violence. Caption: New Hope, 1985 murder, sealed room discovered 2016. Forensic reevaluation. Case solved posthumously. Victoria Brennan inherited the house from an aunt who died surrounded by hoarded newspapers and jars of pickled fruit.
Where neighbors saw clutter, Victoria saw belongings of a life lived long and alone. As she sorted, she found a door and a back parlor wall that had been drywalled over and plastered to blend with the rest of the room. The key, oddly, tucked in a teapot, turned with oil-stiff insistence. On the other side was a narrow, sealed room, air stale and smelling faintly of old paper and rust. The room was a private archive. Shelves held clipped photographs, stacks of letters, and, more disturbingly, binders filled with surveillance-style prints. Pictures of a woman, Catherine Walsh, appeared repeatedly, pinned with dates and locations. Small notes annotated the images: time, what she was wearing, where she had been seen. A shoebox contained objects that family members later identified as belonging to Catherine, a woman who decades earlier had been murdered under circumstances that had, at the time, produced only a cold file. Victoria turned the material over to the police. Detectives cataloged evidence and ran DNA and handwriting comparisons. The laboratory report, created weeks after receipt, linked fibers found in the sealed space to materials recovered near the crime scene, and a handwriting expert concluded that many of the obsessions recorded in the journals matched known samples from Diane, Victoria's aunt. Investigators emphasized the care they took to follow procedure. Items were logged, stored in chain-of-custody bags, and submitted to the state lab for testing. Those test results were the hinge on which the old file creaked open. Official statements listed laboratory confirmation that Diane had compiled the surveillance files and had possessed in her locked room items that had been missing since the 1985 investigation. Investigators charged that Diane's journals contained details only someone with approximate knowledge of Catherine's movements would know. The public record shows that the weight of physical corroboration and detailed record-keeping in the sealed room provided probable cause to bring the case back into focus. Diane had died years earlier. The criminal case thus took an unusual shape. It could not produce the conventional courtroom confrontation between accused and accuser. Instead, the house and its preserved room functioned as a posthumous archive, indicting the living memory of the act. Prosecutors presented the factual findings carefully, framing them as the result of forensic confirmation rather than moral pronouncement. The outcome, as reported, was an administrative closing of a long cold file with the seal of modern investigation impressed upon it. For Victoria, the discovery was a catastrophic inheritance. Her home had literally contained, behind wallpaper and dust, a record of violence done to a neighbor whose name had become a ghost in the community. Victoria chose a form of restitution that fit both her grief and the public sense of duty. She arranged for the demolition of the sealed room and used a portion of the property sale to fund a scholarship in Catherine Walsh's name. The scholarship, targeted at women entering victim advocacy work, stands as a modest attempt to translate a family's hidden secret into something outward-looking and remedial. The sealed room chapter is illustrative for two reasons. First, it shows how private obsession can create an archive that outlives its original keeper, producing evidence that later leads to factual closure. Second, it complicates the community's sense of culpability. When wrongdoing is documented by the person who kept it, who among the living bears moral responsibility? Victoria's choice to erect a tangible memorial was one way to answer that question. Not every story ends with meticulous forensic closure. Some involve split-second choices that avert catastrophe. On Route 18 outside a market town, Evan was driving home when a taillight in his rear view caught his attention. Someone on the roadside in a car with a stuck hood, a lone figure pacing. He slowed, as drivers do in rural areas, to offer help. What he encountered was more immediate than most roadside breakdowns. Caption: Route 18 Rescue, Evan and Rachel, 2014. Suspect Gregory Walsh arrested. Evan's account, later corroborated by 911 tape and police body cam footage, describes a woman who stumbled from a vehicle with a deep, driven exhaustion in her eyes. She clung to him with a fear that made the air thin. In her hands was a phone whose battery was dead, and in her voice was a single thread. She wanted to be gone from that trunk. Evan, a man used to stopping for neighbors, ran to the car's rear bumper and heard the muffled thumping of something from the trunk. He called 911 and kept his voice level, telling the dispatcher where he stood and what he saw. Responding officers opened the trunk. A woman, later identified as Rachel Morrison, sat curled and frightened, her clothing disarranged, her phone battered from attempts to call out. The responding patrols took Rachel's statement and secured the scene. A short while later, through tips and subsequent investigative steps, authorities detained a suspect, Gregory Walsh, a man with prior allegations in multiple counties. He was arrested at a nearby motel. Police records show that he was in possession of items connecting him to other missing person reports under active review by 2 jurisdictions. The rescue was swift in its public arc, but its private aftermath was more complicated. Rachel survived and testified. Her recollection, preserved in criminal filings, describes moments of restraint and panic and a clarity that enabled prosecutors to build a narrative of abduction and transportation. The evidence included vehicle rental records, surveillance footage from gas stations, and witness statements that tied Gregory Walsh to a series of suspicious movements. Evidence: 911 call, body cam, surveillance footage, witness testimony. Gregory's arrest did not erase the damage. One woman in custody's files was found deceased prior to rescue. Another woman had no immediate means of testifying. For Evan, the impact was long-term. He spoke later in a victim impact interview about the weight of survivor guilt. What would have happened if he had driven by? He visited Rachel in the weeks after her release from the hospital and described the encounter as a shared, strange responsibility that never entirely left either of them. The trial that followed Gregory's arrest was, in legal terms, a mixed result of some convictions and ongoing investigations. Prosecutors relied on both forensic data and the harrowing clarity of survivor testimony. The case demonstrated something local investigators had long suspected. Some predators operate across county lines and rely on the public's willingness to interpret these incidents as isolated crises rather than elements of a pattern. When Evan stopped his car, he interrupted that pattern. But not every interruption happens in time. Not every town is lucky enough to have an eyewitness. Our final case brings us back to a family's long ache, a disappearance that froze a household for 3 decades and, in the end, produced revelations that implicated both individuals and institutions. In Bethlehem, a teenage girl named Emily vanished from the edge of the woods where she had been known to walk and daydream. Her mother kept a journal, a private log of nights paced and questions unanswered, pages filled with scrawled names and frustrated entries about police reports that seemed to stall. Caption: Bethlehem, 1989 disappearance. Found after 30 years. Modern GPR and excavation. Institutional failures exposed. The initial investigation, as archived police files show, was a standard once familiar ritual: canvassing, interview statements, and an all-night search. Over time, though, the case slowed. The mother's journal, later shared with investigative reporters, contains entries that suggested a suspect known to locals, and hints that certain leads were not fully pursued.
Those entries, when compared against case logs and internal memoranda from the sheriff's office, raised questions about whether some lines of inquiry had been improperly dismissed. Decades later, renewed interest in cold cases and advances in forensic methods brought a state investigative team to the area. Relatives and activists organized to push for a fresh look. Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys, ordered by a county prosecutor acting on renewed public pressure, showed anomalies on a parcel of land adjoining the woods where Emily had last been seen.
Excavation teams worked carefully, mindful of the need to preserve context and chain of custody. What they found, at a depth shallow enough to suggest hurried concealment, were skeletal remains. Laboratory analysts performed osteological and dental comparisons. The medical examiner later issued a confirmation that the remains matched Emily's dental records. That confirmation, brief in bureaucratic language but enormous in consequence, turned 30 years of speculation into a formal finding. The county prosecutor subsequently issued a press release noting the confirmation and the decision to reclassify the file as a homicide investigation. Caption: Forensic methods, GPR, excavation, dental comparison. Case reopened as homicide. The discovery set off a cascade of scrutiny directed at institutional actors who had handled the original inquiry. Reviewers examined case notes and found, they reported, unexplained delays in following up on certain tips and instances where jurisdictional confusion between municipal and county officers had allowed leads to go cold. A parallel review by an independent panel raised concerns that local relationships and personal familiarity with suspects may have contributed to a lower threshold for suspicion in certain interviews. These findings did not produce immediate indictments in every instance, but they did reveal a pattern of administrative lapses that, once exposed, forced a public conversation about accountability. For the family, the return of remains and the confirmation offered a bittersweet relief. They had advocated for decades living with a grief that never fully landed in one place. The identification allowed for ceremony, a proper burial, and the start of a foundation in Emily's name that aims to provide resources for families of missing persons. The foundation funds independent reviews of cold cases and offers modest support for families seeking legal advocacy when institutional reviews stall. Taken together, these 10 stories are more than a catalog of misfortune. They form a pattern that repeats across geography and time. The veneer of small-town normalcy overlaying evidence of criminal activity or human tragedy. The motifs recur. Sealed doors, unmarked graves, the apple pie neighbor, the flashlight beam dying out at the corn line, crosses along a quarry's edge. Folklore grows around these motifs because communities need narratives to make sense of loss. Sometimes that folklore masks wrongdoing. Sometimes it is a means for people to process the unprocessable. As we step back from each of these accounts, several themes deserve clear emphasis. First, the cost of curiosity. In case after case, James in Minersville, Tyler in Emporium, Adam at the quarry, those who asked questions paid social or personal prices. Whistleblowers and persistent family members often became targets of ostracism, intimidation, or worse. The moral labor of holding communities accountable frequently falls to those least equipped to bear it. Second, the power of modern forensics and persistence. In McKissport and Bethlehem, ground-penetrating radar and dental comparison turned rumor into fact. In New Hope, archived materials within a sealed room became a forensic bridge to long cold evidence. These technologies do not produce instant miracles. They rely on someone, often an advocate, a family member, or a curious researcher, pressing authorities to re-examine old ground. For every case solved by a lab test, someone had to persist in asking the right question at the right time. Third, the uncomfortable entanglement of folklore and fact. Haunted house talk, stories of a neighbor who was always odd, rumors about midnight runs, these narratives play roles in community cohesion and in how towns process memory.
But when a haunted story has a factual basis, when a legend literally records the locations of human remains or the route of abduction, the line between myth and evidence collapses. Investigators learn to treat folklore as both a potential lead and a hazard. Useful when it points toward a physical location, but also risky because folklore can distort eyewitness memory and motivate false leads. Fourth, institutional failure and complicity, sometimes by omission. In several files we examined, initial reports indicate procedural oversights, delayed follow-ups, or jurisdictional confusion that allowed leads to cool. Such lapses are not necessarily malevolent. They can result from limited resources, poor record-keeping, or the human inclination to prioritize the comfortable over the difficult. Yet the impact is real. Lives remain unresolved, families are denied closure, and community trust in institutions erodes. Finally, the human aftermath. These are not case numbers, they are people's lives. The individuals who move through these stories, James who left his town, Haley who found a body while researching her family tree, Evan who stopped his car, carry consequences that are not captured in police reports. Survivors and relatives navigate grief, suspicion, and legal limbo. Some create memorials and foundations, others move away or withdraw. Many continue to live with the knowledge that the truth, even when partially revealed, fails to fit neatly into social expectations. There is also a practical impulse that runs through these stories. How can we as a public respond when confronted with a legend that might be a crime? First, treat folklore as a possible lead without granting it the status of evidence. Share credible tips with law enforcement rather than social media conjecture that can muck up investigations. Second, support independent reviews of cold cases through scholarship, foundations, or volunteer efforts that take a professional approach. Third, protect those who come forward. Anonymity for witnesses, legal protections for whistleblowers, and community supports for family members who pursue truth are not luxuries in this work, they're necessities. We have navigated a map of towns where ordinary gestures masked extraordinary harms. Apple pies left on stoops, basement renovations that hid cavities of evidence, a photograph that changed a case's trajectory, a rescuer whose instincts prevented an ongoing pattern of abduction. These stories show how legends are born, sometimes as a community's attempt to explain what it cannot name, sometimes as a deliberate strategy to divert attention away from criminality, often as a mixture of both. As this program closes, remember what these cases collectively demand of us: attention. Small towns, for all their charm, are not immune to organized theft, to predation, or to the slow erasure of records. Who watches for the watchful? Who keeps inventory when the ledger goes missing? The habit of assuming that community equals safety can be an inviting blind spot. We must maintain curiosity that is careful, compassionate, and procedural. If you have information about any of the cases presented here, contact the appropriate county or state police listed in the description. Do not post unverified allegations online. Reach out to investigators who can act on credible tips. For those who want to support victims and families, links in the description will connect you to organizations that assist with legal guidance, counseling, and cold case advocacy. One last note: legends will persist. They are the stories communities tell themselves in the dark. But when a legend lines up with police reports, forensic findings, and witness testimony, it deserves a different treatment than a campfire yarn. It deserves investigation, compassion, and, where possible, justice. Caption: for resources and contact information, see video description. If you have information about any of these cases, contact the listed jurisdiction. Subscribe for more carefully sourced investigations that honor victims and respect the work of law enforcement. If these stories moved you, consider sharing this video with someone who will treat them with the same sober attention. Above all, remember that curiosity, when practiced responsibly, is one of the few tools we possess that can turn a legend back into evidence, and, in doing so, turn silence into answers. Thank you for watching.